Thanks so much for coming to our first day of Supply and Demand, Encoding Logistics, Labor, and the Mediation of Making. I'm Matt Hockenberry, and this is...
I am Carleton.
And we are organizers, along with Nicole Starosielski, who is hiding, invisible to me, and Tim, is Tim here? We lost Tim. Dr. Tim Wood as of 2 days ago, so we're happy to have him here. Just going to start with, we were just talking that we didn't coordinate what we're going to say at the introduction, but also there's no logistics here. But
we weren't supposed to say that.
no, it's total transparency. So, but everything else has been highly coordinated, and we're going to talk just a little bit about the plan for the conference over the rest of today and then into tomorrow. So today we had a little opening screening that, thank you for those of you who attended, which was great. We're going to start with an informal roundtable, and then we're going to have our first panel. And the first panel is really just kind of a subsection, I guess, of some of the themes that I think we're going to see emerge over tomorrow when we have our 4 full panels, then followed by our keynote speakers. Do you want to add anything there, Colette? Yes, okay. But I'd like to talk just a little bit about logistics, supply chains, and why we think this is interesting. And if you're here, presumably you also think this is interesting. You don't have maybe a fear in this place today and tomorrow that when you start talking about logistics and supply chains, you'll just see this familiar look of total disinterest from the person you're talking to. This is a safe space for exploring these issues. So I came to an interest in logistics from the perspective of design, making products, sourcing materials, and discovering how insanely weird it was how we choose where things come from and how we make things in modern production. And so we've been exploring that over the past decade, I guess, in media studies, trying to think about how logistics is an mediative frame for not just production, distribution, assembly, but for lots of different things. Can we talk about digital supply chains? Can we talk about the aesthetics of supply chains? What kind of questions about the mediation of logistics of the supply chain can we talk about? And so those are sort of some of the themes that we've organized the conference around. We have a number of panels tomorrow morning, sponsored by NYU's Urban Democracy Lab. Would you like to say something about that?
Sure, I guess I'll say briefly, Urban Democracy Lab is a lab hosted in Carleton here at NYU, and they focus mostly on urban issues, and they have really incredible programming, host a lot of incredible events, and they actually have a doctoral fellow, 2 fellows a year, I think, which is a phenomenal program. So if you're at NYU and you're interested, I would look into that. They actually just released their new video, like advertisement for the program yesterday, and it's one of the coolest things. And they go by UDL often, or Urban Democracy Lab, so check them out. They're really fantastic, and they're very excited about this as well. And again, it's the first 2 panels tomorrow that they are co-sponsoring.
And of course, our host department here is NYU's Department of Media, Culture, and Communication, and we're really grateful that MCC has agreed to sponsor this event as part of the MCC event series. And we've had a lot of help, and we're going to thank people at the end tomorrow also, but we just like to thank them now as well.
So special thanks to Deb Pedlowski, Carlisa Robinson, Tracy Figueroa, Shima as well here in the department, and also our friends at Urban Democracy Lab, Jean-Paul Loyoki and Rebecca Amato.
Okay, is there anything we're missing? Let's coordinate this live.
Yeah, great. One key thing.
I haven't tweeted in about 4 years, but I just tweeted my first 2 tweets. I'm very proud of myself. There are pictures of Natasha's screening. Thank you. And so I feel obliged to remind everyone that there is a hashtag for this event. It is supply and command. The hash goes before supply, and then and is spelled out, and then command is also spelled out in one word. use it. Give me tips if my tweeting is a little odd, but also like retweet me, or I don't even know how this really works. But anyway, that's the hashtag.
Yeah. And if anyone has any questions or concerns over the next 2 days, feel free to let me or let know. We'll try to help you as best we can. I know a lot of people come in from out of town, and we really appreciate it. And so if there's anything we can do to make your time in New York City more enjoyable, please let us know. I guess we'll go ahead and get started with the roundtable. Okay. So, our first event is a roundtable about logistics. And we're very happy to be joined today by Fred Moten, Shannon, Mattern, and Liam Cole-Young. And if you guys would like to come up here, Nicole and Susan are going to join me in moderating this roundtable. Yes, so I think as moderators, we're just going to try to sort of set the stage here a little bit for how we think this conversation is going to go. Some of the themes that we're interested in talking about in kind of a more casual setting, I guess. Although now that we're actually sitting up here, it doesn't feel casual at all. But in my mind, it felt very casual. But I think in media studies. Thinking about logistics, thinking about global production, there are a few touch points that come to mind. And the one that is most obvious to me, and I think to maybe some of us in the room, is this reference we have from John Durham Peters about this concept of logistical media. And this is, if you Google, logistics and media, all of a sudden you find these fleeting references from John Durham Peters talking about the sort of inherent coordinating potential of different kinds of media forms. So things like clocks and things like calendars. But there's a question here, and this is one of the questions that we hope to explore over the course of the conference, is what media is not logistical? Where does that stop? Is all media logistical media? And if that's the case, what does that say about the way we've thought about media studies and mediation for the past few decades, where we're thinking about things like television and film and content? Are those logistical media in a different kind of way? Are they some sort of fluke, an aberration in a larger, longer history of what is almost always logistical media? So thinking through what is really at stake in trying to define a relationship between media and logistics is one of the themes that I would like to push. And I think Susan is going to say something.
Yeah, so one conceptual and conversational path that we can take to this large question of what is logistical media might be how logistics pushes or drives media, which is to say how logistical forms, processes, and priorities, efficiency, acceleration, supply, delegated decision-making, automation, heteromation, how all those things are reshaping media forms and practices. So I'm kind of representing English literary and cultural studies, and also I'm a 19th centuryist. So I'm going to offer two examples from the past that have like a kind of contemporary resonance, I think. First might be the postal system. If we recall that Netflix actually began as a mail service, and some of us still have a subscription that includes a DVD that comes in the mail, that I could put in a device and play. That's how it began. Of course, now it's only a short time later, something really different. In the 1840s in Britain, Rowland Hill modernized and standardized the postal system. And so that's when we get envelopes that give the letter a certain degree of privacy. That's when we get adhesive stamps that sort of require the sender to pay for the letter. And so these things kind of become the system that shaped the subsequent global standard. and an increasingly literate population becomes a nation and an empire of letter writers who have a certain degree of expressivity as they're communicating with each other. So Bernhard Zieger, for example, in an excellent book called Relays, sees literature itself as an episode within this new system of expressivity. Now, the logistics behind that, if you can imagine, by the end of the 19th century, the mail gets delivered as often as 5 times a day in central London and Birmingham. To make that happen, there are these traveling post offices, which are post offices, they're sorting centers that are on rail cars. And as the trains are traveling around southern and Midlands of England, letter sorters are sorting the mail, and then it's this very complex logistical system that's producing all of this accelerated, more frequent communication. So this system kind of produces a whole lot of new media forms, not only personal letters, new modes of advertising. It also revamped an older media form, which is the book. So that's the second one I'll just mention briefly. The circulating library of the late 18th and early 19th century is arguably one of the most important features of the revolution in print. So this is the way in which books, novels especially, could be divided into 3 volumes, and then you would get the first one, return it, get the second one, return it, and so on. And that distribution method shaped social reading practices. So in a middle-class family, the father would get the first volume, read it, check to make sure that it was morally edifying before passing it along to his wife. She might read it, make sure it was okay for the kids, right? The second volume comes, they go back, right? And this, kind of increases, enhances the logistics of distributing novels, all throughout the reading public. Also, it shapes the narratives and the genres that are available to people. So sensation fiction, the novels of development, the real texture of the literary is kind of, I think, intimately related to the logistical system of distribution. Now, not everyone approved of this. There's a wonderful quote by the Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who complained, and this is a formulation that really, I think, presages Adorno and Horkheimer's critique of the broadcast culture industry over a century later. He complains that the circulating library, quote, fixes, reflects, and transmits the moving phantasms of one man's delirium so as to people the barrenness of 100 other brains. So he's criticizing what he perceived to be the homogenizing effect of this logistical system on individual imaginations. And as with so many 19th century diatribes on new media, he was both myopically elitist and uncannily prescient. We could think of the fact that Amazon, perhaps our decade's most important logistical company, began as a bookseller. So our critiques of Amazon, everything new is old again, if we go back to Coleridge. So those are just a couple examples to suggest some ways that logistics might be driving new media forms and more metamorphoses through history. So one way into Matt's larger question of what is logistical media.
And so I'll just pick up on that note. So we've been having this conversation in the months leading up to the conference, really trying to think about, obviously we're all invested, well, maybe not obviously, but like many of us are invested in logistics and believe that logistics is important. And one of the things that we aim to do with, the conference and our writing and so on is to talk to media studies, to talk to all of the various fields that are invested in media and culture and representation, in which logistics has not always been a fundamental object of inquiry. And for those of you that I've chatted with before, this probably arises out of, at least for me, an interest in infrastructure, right? So media studies often focuses on representations and aesthetics, but not always. And there are other ways to think about the kind of materiality of media. Logistics is a fundamental, driver of media technologies. And then logistical media, I think as John Durham Peters has described it, is a way of pointing our attention to the coordinating functions of media. And so I just want to point out two other ways, two other connections between logistics and media studies, the study of culture and representation that we, at least I, but I think several others are invested in. So one is around this idea of imagination. So that there are logistical imaginations, there are imaginations of logistical systems, whether this is documentaries about container ships, whether this is the imagination of an automated future. These imaginations, these cultural imaginations, facilitate and pave the way for new logistical forms, as well as logistical forms produce forms of imagination, produce aesthetics, and so on. So I think, on one hand, we might look at the sort of technical underpinnings of our new media forms, but also the ways that our new media forms are shaping the imagination of logistics in the world, and all the sort of implications that that has. So then the second way, I think, that I would point out the relationship, or the second connection between logistics and media, I think is about the sort of techniques of logistics in its kind of narrow sense as like supply chain operation. That underneath as we've been doing research, underneath all of the sort of logistical advances, there are often new media technologies, right? So, Matt has done work on, the way that the telephone reshapes what logistics is and what logistics can be. And we see this obviously with digital media today. Logistics becomes, something else through new techniques, through new media forms. And so this is, I guess, it can seem sort of tautological. You're like, logistical media, all of these different relationships between logistics and media. But I hope that comes across, because I feel that logistics and media are innately intertwined, and that the fact that we haven't really been studying it just means that there are many things to say and many things to look at. And the last thing that I would say is that one of the things that has been often absent in studies of logistical media is a kind of deep understanding of culture, and especially of difference. Whether that's the sort of and the kind of social dynamics that underpin logistical forms. So to look at media's coordinating dimension is to look at the ways that global media operates to sort and categorize and reproduce different regimes along class, race, gender, sexual lines. That's something that I think we're also invested in making this connection between media and logistics. We hope to be able to articulate those forms of power. So with that, I think we'll kick it over to Fred. Question mark?
Thanks, I'm glad to be here. I'm kind of torn between trying to improvise and just trying to read something, but I don't know, is that horrible if I read?
You can read or improvise, either way.
Whatever you like.
Well, maybe some combination of both when I start to falter. But I'm like Susan. I'm a literary studies person too, pretty much. And but my interest in logistics came in part as a function of my sort of long-time friendship and collaboration with Stefano Harney, who teaches in business schools, and we. But who also, like me, is sort of grounded sort of methodologically and, temperamentally within the framework of Black studies. And one of the things that this sort of led for us to conclude, more specifically with regard to the problem of logistics, supply chain management and so forth, is that one of the fundamental places for development and innovation and optimization of logistics in the modern world was the slave trade. And when you think about the slave trade as both a problem for logistics and also as a laboratory for the development and optimization of logistics, a whole range of really interesting issues begin to emerge. One of which has to do with the whole problem of what it is that is actually being moved, what it is that's actually being transferred and in being transferred, also what it is being transformed. So obviously enslaved people are being moved. They in a certain sense constitute the objects of the supply chain. But we also know that a whole new kind of cosmopolitan transatlantic world emerges as a function of the problem of movement, of the movement of these people who are conceived of as goods. And in this respect, the line between the enslaved person as the object of logistics and, in a certain sense, the salesman or tradesman as the object of logistics gets blurry. And we also know that part of what happens with regard to logistics, because of the intensity of this necessity of constantly improving the supply chain and the management of that chain, is that those who are caught up in that movement, both from the perspective of the ones who are being sold, but also the ones who are selling, also have to be submitted to this regime of improvement. And it produces a tremendous pressure on the development of what people want to think of as sort of normative subjectivity. And I think it produces all kinds of interesting effects with regard to the history of literature. One way to think about it is that that entire sort of set of metaphysical problems that we associate with the idea of building and with the notion specifically of the Bildungsroman is both a scene for this problematic of improvement and also a place where the whole problem of improvement can very quickly turn into a problem of monstrosity or of a kind of devolutionary fall. So one of the pieces that we've been really interested in the last, sorry, I got it. Sorry. But one of the texts that we both we got fascinated by, well, a couple things. One, so here I'll read a little bit. One of the texts that we became really invested in and sort of obsessed with was Kafkas Metamorphosis, because in a lot of ways it kind of embodies this set of problems that we are concerned with. So just bear with me. I'll read you 4 texts, just 4 excerpts from letters that Kafka wrote to his fiancée, whose name was Felice Bauer. And this is during the time in which he was actually composing the Metamorphosis, around 1912. Just 4 short excerpts. First is, he says, "A short story that occurred to me during my misery in bed and oppresses me with inmost intensity." And he writes up, "The hero of my little story, who also had a very bad time, and yet this is only the latest rung of his misfortune, which is now becoming permanent." Later he says, "For who knows, the more I write and the more I free myself, the purer and more worthy of you I may become, but no doubt there is still a lot more of me to be gotten rid of, and the nights can never be long enough for this business, which incidentally is extremely voluptuous." And finally he writes, "My little story would certainly have been finished tomorrow, but now I have to leave at 6 tomorrow morning and arrive at Reichenberg at 10 and go on to Kratzau at 7 the next morning to appear in court." So I'll keep reading. There are 2 pages. The letters were written in late in 1912 as Kafka was writing the Metamorphosis, a process or product trial that Kafka a decade later would describe as an indiscretion. He's deeply concerned with the logistics of writing, with the proper mode of delivery, but also the proper timetable of construction or composition. The Metamorphosis would have been better written, he says, without the interruptions, the stops and starts. If only the line could have been more direct. Everything is filtered through the anxieties that attend the imperative to improve, to optimize. In the optimization of the story is all bound up with Kafka's own optimization, right? What it is, he wants to optimize a certain delivery, but he's also invested in optimizing himself so he can get married. The story of a traveling salesman's problems turns out to emerge from and as a variation on the traveling salesman problem, about which more in 1 minute. Inefficiency leaves a permanent residue, a taint of voluptuousness, which simultaneously marks decay and incompleteness and a radical extra completeness. We feel compelled to say that Kafka cannot claim this monstrosity that he becomes, but we want to say also that his work makes it possible for us to claim it or to make a claim upon it. In other words, when the optimization of the supply chain fails, when logistical optimization fails, one tends towards insecthood, towards monstrosity. And the question is whether or not there is something for us in the claiming of that monstrosity. Just a little bit more about the traveling salesman problem. At the intersection of modes of inquiry that include theoretical computer science, the theory of computational complexity, and combinatorial optimization, there lies something called the traveling salesman problem. The problem is, given a list of cities and the distances between each pair of cities, what is the shortest possible route that visits each city exactly once and returns to the origin city? This problem was given its first mathematical formulation in the mid-19th century by Irish mathematician W.R. Hamilton, and was refined in the 1930s and popularized in the fields just mentioned in the 50s and 60s. It continues to be a hot topic in mathematics and the natural sciences today, but before its mathematical formulation and formalization of it as a problem, it is a problem for businessmen, stated for and by businessmen within the context of a set of narratives of building, of evaluative self-picturing and improvement given in and as a kind of capacity for framing. It turns out where optimization and speciation, management and racialization converge, and this convergence is presented as early as 1832 in a book called Der Handlungsreisende, right, which is called The Traveling Salesman. The title goes on, how he must be and what he should do in order to get commissions and be sure of the happy success in his business. Right? Self-improvement, self-optimization implies a story, one in which the ladder of success is always also the ladder of misfortune. Gregor's ascent and descent are inseparable from one another and from Kafka's in the movement within his writing from his stories to their story. In any case, in offering a modest supplement to Borges' list of Kafka's precursors, I want to argue that the Metamorphosis is Kafka's formalization of the traveling salesman problem that emerges in an investigation of profound existential homelessness. Because you can't get home once you embark on the business trip whose purpose is to secure one's home. There's no proper return because home isn't there. And because in any case, the one who leaves is never the one who returns. And because, deeper still, the one who leaves was never one in the first place. So what I guess I'm trying to say is that this problem of logistics is inseparable from the problem of Bildung. It's inseparable from the sort of normalization of a certain kind of idea of subjectivity. And furthermore, that when we talk about the optimization of subjectivity, similarly to the optimization of supply chain management, there's always a kind of devolutionary fall encoded in it from the very beginning. And the question is there anything in that fall for us to claim? Is there anything in that fall that we can do something?
I'm gonna try to project. I hate microphones. I hate hearing my voice like being in frame. I thought I would talk a little bit about how I sort of came to logistics. So I work in media theory and history, and one of the things I'm really excited about with this conference is kind of learning a little bit about how the logistics concept circulates in other kind of discursive communities. So I come at logistics from that kind of media theory angle, and I first came at it through Paul Virilio, who, from whom Friedrich Hitler really borrowed quite a lot, sort of in the same way that like every good idea Marshall McLuhan had was in Lewis Mumford. I feel in a certain way that almost every good idea that Hitler ever had was in some form in Virilio. So Virilio is a phenomenologist, and his primary consideration is the body and perception, right? How modern techniques kind of reconfigure the way we sense and perceive. And in Virilio, everything's about speed and movement. So you start to see when you're reading Virilio, and he writes in this style that's like very affective, everything's kind of flying at the reader at a certain kind of velocity. So you start to see how these kind of, certain media technologies like screens and planes and bullet trains kind of fetishize speed and orient us toward speed and optimization and efficiency, and some of these other themes that have been coming up. And speed is an engineering problem, right? So how do you get an object from point A to point B in as little time and with as little resistance as possible? So it's about the elimination of obstacles. These obstacles are physical and spatial, but also temporal. So Virilio argues that the modern mind sort of becomes obsessed with techniques by which to do this work of optimization. So techniques of calculation, compressing, circulating, computing, these kinds of things. So none of these techniques are new, of course, right? It's not a kind of categorical break, but they're given kind of increased emphasis in the modern period. So in this kind of Virillian lineage, logistics is like an operating logic almost, or a kind of telos of modernity. And there's obvious resonance, right, with this theorization of logistics and speed with the way that the industry of supply chain management kind of orients itself, reducing spatial and temporal barriers, the kind of view of the world as pure logistical field, and everything in it as cargo to be moved around at maximum velocity. So that's the kind of one side or one angle into logistics that I come at. And then there's the related stream of logistical media, which has come up, right, in kind of John Durham Peters' thing, which is less about perception and more about the actual technologies and techniques of order, of calculation, of separation, these kinds of things, which establish, as he says, the kind of basic coordinates of time and space. And this is both at the kind of individual level, but also at broader, like civilizational level. So there's a sort of telescoping between the granular and the expansive. So different societies obviously experience time in vastly different ways, and different societies organize space in vastly different ways. So looking at how these conceptions are articulated and ordered can teach us quite a lot about, who we are, how we are, and how we got here. So Peters looks at, kind of ancient media like calendars, clocks, towers, but then there's more recent stuff like radar. So Judd Case does really interesting work on radar as logistical medium. My colleague at Carleton, Chris Russell, does really excellent work on kind of Earth observing media, right, that sort of renders the Earth in particular kinds of ways. So this stream, as I see it anywhere, as I read it, it's kind of less explicitly about modernity, and it's more about these kind of surprising connections or kind of folding historical time periods together. So in my own work, I've tried to kind of work with both of these registers because the thing that I study, or have been studying for probably too long, the list, right? So the list as a kind of informational form, it operates in both registers, right? So lists are an agent of this kind of modern fetish of rationality, efficiency, speed. So they are a medium of logistics, but they're also a very ancient technique of ordering knowledge and culture. So they are a logistical medium, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in my talk on the panel, so I don't want to scoop myself there. So I guess what I would say is these two kind of planes, the intervention, some of the interventions that I see them making are expanding the timescales by which we study and compare media and technology, like really expanding them. Also, there's an emphasis on the kind of temporal aspects of media devices, systems, and techniques. So complementing spatial conceptions of media. And then like infrastructure, as Nicole kind of alluded to, I think logistics is this kind of traveling concept that gives name to a sort of layer of activity and operations that are central, central to the way we make the world and act upon it and through it. So logistics is kind of, I see it like, it might be sort of overdetermined by reading like Benjamin Bratton's work on the stack, but it's sort of like this layer between the surfaces, interfaces, texts, images of kind of traditional media and cultural studies, and then the earth layer of elements. So that's where I kind of see it situated.
I don't think I'm going to try to project. Would you proceed?
Yes, of course. Sort of.
Thanks. Okay, I don't trust myself to project. Is this on? Can you
Yeah.
hear me? Okay, so going back to your original question about how elastic is the term logistics and what kind of new work does it do, I wonder, and maybe this is something that will come up over the next day and a half, is how logistic might fit into the same category or genre as terms like, actually let me step back a bit. Logistically, I will rewind a bit and say, I guess my interest in some of these concepts came before I was even using a term like logistics. I finished my dissertation about 15 years ago here in this department about library buildings, which I found through researching them are an architecture that is designed, again, I didn't use this term in the dissertation, but it totally fits, as logistical systems to allow for the movement of not only printed books, but also media of all different types of formats, all of which require their own kind of circulation systems, their own classification systems, their own kind of climatic conditions for storage, the logistics for different populations. This is again kind of honoring that informational labor that happens in information spaces like this. So the people who pull the material off the truck at the loading dock have a very different logistical system they have to follow through the building than does the administration or the reference librarians. And then there are all these different publics that a public library in particular has to serve. So you have researchers who might be using special collections, kids, teenagers, and then you also have the disabled, mothers pushing baby carriages, and the homeless, all of which have to be funneled through the building, circulated in a way so that maybe they don't come in contact with each other and offend one another, or so that you do have productive kind of intersections. So again, I wouldn't have used the term logistics back in the day, but now that I think about it, kind of now that this term is more in circulation, I realize that this is a way of thinking about how an architecture is a logistical system. But one of the things I'm wondering, going back to my original comment, was if logistics is one of those words like infrastructure or architecture. Back in the day when I was writing my dissertation, everything was an architecture of fill in the blank. So architects got really annoyed at their concepts. The archive is another one of those things, like archives of fill in the blank, archaeologies of fill in the blank. So I often wonder, do we have any archivists or archaeologists here? Like, how annoying is it that people keep co-opting your terms? So I'm wondering again, what's going to happen to logistics if it's the next thing? But scaling up, I guess scaling up and down from the architectural scale. I also write a lot about cities. My most recent book and a lot of my public scholarship is about, again, logistics, whether I use that term or not, at the urban scale. So if you look at the way New York has historically been organized, and Aurora Wallace, who teaches here, has written quite a bit about this. You have places like Printers Row or Radio Row, even the convergence of different types of manufacture or media production that tend to be coalescing in certain parts of the city, specifically because the conduits of the city, the telegraph boys who work for Western Union, the pneumatic tubes that actually send the posts between different places. They wanted to minimize the time of delivery, so that's why you have certain industries located in close proximity to one another. So the city itself has essentially an efficient system that is designed to optimize logistical operations. There's a challenge with that in terms of particularly contemporary data-driven forms of efficiency, which I've written about quite a bit in recent years, and lots of people have studied. Actually, you have a few dissertation people here studying that. So when you think of the city as the telos of the city is purely efficiency, to minimize times of transit of both information and bodies and vehicles and shipping, all sorts of things. What other reasons for being for a city are left out when efficiency, optimization is the primary goal for all of planning, essentially? So I think it might be interesting, productive to think of what is bracketed, what really productive ways of thinking about what ontological issues are bracketed or left out when we think about logistics as kind of the defining goal or mode of operation for something like a city or a media system, or, and again, you could apply this to a lot of different case studies. And then I think more recently I've also been looking at a more micro scale about furniture. And this connects back to my work on libraries. So it's not just the architecture, it's also all the shelves and book carts and other things. And so I've looked at the history of shelving systems, the history of desks and ergonomic furniture, and how these, in a way, are logistical systems to comport our bodies. And this is a gendered and classed and raced thing as well. So how we design different types of equipment and machinery to essentially move bodies, to allow bodies to relate to different media technologies in different ways, usually to increase efficiency as well. There's a long history of using media to both make this use of equipment intelligible and to make it more efficient, like the Gilbreth's films, for instance. Taylorism used a lot of kind of early film to record the movement of bodies, how women's hands fold papers and put them into the right drawers, for instance. So the use of media technologies to improve logistics of the office, for instance. And then I'll just, I guess the last part I'll stop is that a lot of this more recent work has made me think of, again, what senses are often bracketed out. This actually came through a conversation that Nicole and I had a few months ago. I had forgotten that I've written a lot about sound over the past few years, and like, why don't we think about what logistics sounds like? The film that we just saw, I don't know how many of you were there, really drove this home. The fact that bodies singing on the chain gang and the cotton fields, song and music pumped into the factory floor has long been a force to essentially keep bodies moving. The sound of machinery, how any type of manual or mechanical labor requires a certain type of understanding of listening to the machine so they can tell you that it's functioning properly. Perhaps, I'm going to learn about this, but perhaps there are certain kind of calls amongst the workers at a dock, for instance. You know, we could look back at literature, Moby Dick. What are the sounds of seafaring, for instance? The sounds of kind of historical forms of supply chains. So this is a project I'm going to probably start in earnest over the summer, but just thinking about other forms of sensory input that could help us to think more about the affective ways in which logistics operate as well. So that's where I'll stop.
Great, well, thank you all so much. And I guess as moderators, I want to first give the chance for anyone who is on the panel to respond to anything else, and then we'll open it up to the audience. All right, the audience it is. I'll run back to them.
Are you sure?
Yeah, all right, I'll run back. So questions? Comments? Questions, comments? Provocations? Concerns?
So I think all of you mentioned in some way the idea of optimization, and I loved how Fred introduced the idea of optimization of the South and logistics of the South. And I wonder to what degree you all think that optimization is separable from logistics.
Well, my impulse is to say that it's not really separable, and that, in fact, well, again, the work of the thinking that I've been engaged in with Stefano has been sort of really interested in the relationship between those things and we can add a third term, that optimization or improvement and logistics are themselves both very much bound up with the idea of property or of ownership. And that once these things are recognized as having a systematic relation to one another, one of the kind of complicated effects of that relation, that structure, is that the line between what is sold and who does the selling, between what is moved and who does the moving, that line really, really blurs. And because that systemic relation is really an important one in the development of capital, and it's a really important movement in the 19th century particularly. It's not an accident that it sort of goes hand in hand with the development of a certain way of narrativizing or picturing, self-improvement, where self-improvement is all bound up again with this notion of self-possession. So yeah, I mean, for me at least, they're all bound up with one another and they're tied with another thing too. But I don't.
Yeah, I could, just to connect to that, the place where my mind goes is actually aestheticism. which is the late 19th century sort of artistic movement that sort of sees the self as a project, an ongoing project, and an ongoing aesthetic project. And so Walter Pater sort of talks about, at every moment there's some exquisite impression that you could be perceiving and taking in. And our goal in life is to multiply our perceptions and our sensations, and to be always sort of, in a way, consuming our environment in a way that builds up ourselves into this repository of, tremendous aesthetic sensation. So that comes right out of this 19th century telos of development and Bildung. And then it turns into, I think, the modernist, Kafkaesque rebellion against that, or critique of it, as what am I trying to do, optimizing myself? How is that separate from, just like industrializing and entrepreneurializing myself, which, we're all kind of, again, familiar with in our own economic moment. But so it's an odd moment to think about the aesthetic as related to logistics, because the aesthetics are supposed to slow down the circulation of capital, but there's a way in which they can dovetail with it too.
I guess I would say certainly the kind of like hegemonic ideal of logistics is kind of indissociable from optimization, but I'm interested, like there are also logistics of resistance and refusal, right, which are about kind of slow, like blockages or kind of slowing things down. So like Anna Feigenbaum's work on the tent and the camp, right, in protest movements, and the kind of logistics of those types of operations are maybe like a counter kind of space in which we can think about something that's oriented specifically against that sort of overarching hegemonic ideal of optimization. So, and then there's, like histories of labor movements and strikes and, I'm from Canada, so indigenous politics and indigenous resistances and things like that also have logistical kinds of operations. And so kind of thinking about the tension between those things is, I think, maybe part of what's intriguing about this conference and this kind of emerging sphere of work on logistical media and communication.
I think also just picking up on Liam's point, the fact that the connection between optimization and logistical spaces can be turned against itself, the fact that so many protests happen at logistical sites, at docks, the entry kind of lanes to bridges, for instance. So the very connection between those concepts can be used to kind of intentionally slow down the operations, to call attention to the protested issue, whatever it might be. I also think it might be interesting to think about what's a logistics of the aleatory, or what's a ludic logistics look like. I'm sure game designers might think about these kinds of things. I know that, again, to go back to the issue of libraries, not only are you designing different circulation routes for the people who want to get to the item they came in for most efficiently, you also want to specifically design for people who want the romantic serendipitous experience. So there, you're actually creating logistical flows for people to have chance encounters, to intentionally be inefficient in their search. So how you can maybe apply, and this is I don't mean to romanticize it, although I often do, but that's an institution, as we discussed a few days ago, Diana, that is a little bit of a space of exception because it's not driven by the profit motive in the way so many other institutions are. So is it possible, retailers, merchandisers do this. They try to kind of, again, commercialize the serendipitous encounter with as many kind of impulse buy possibilities as possible. So they're increasing that inefficient connection in kind of circuitous routes to the store to optimize their sales, but it's not the optimum route through the store. So there's the kind of an inverse relationship between straight route of transit and actual amount of purchase dollars ultimately. So anyway, it just might be interesting to think of other contexts in which you could apply this aleatory, this chance, or the ludic in ways that might have different ideological endpoints.
I guess what I would add to this is I feel like there isn't, like logistics, okay, we're throwing it out there like infrastructure, like many other things that are a concept that could describe a lot of processes. And the question, I think, is always well, what does that do? Why? What does it do for us to talk about all of these things like architecture, libraries and so on as, logistical, rather than saying, I'm going to do a history of labor practices, or I'm going to do a history of infrastructure, right? Like when essentially you could use a lot of those terms. So I think, to respond to the sort of optimization thing, I think logistics does a few things for us. One is that, like, for those who are studying infrastructure or sort of like material substrates of communication and movement and so on, to talk about logistics, which at least for me, I think is like the way that circulation is coordinated, right? The way that traffic is coordinated across an infrastructure. It's not just to say, like, look, there's like a road, and to say, like, this is how, whether it's designers, planners, or people who are traveling on that road, coordinate movement. So that's, like, I feel like what logistics points us to. What that does is it, on one hand, it points, for those who are studying infrastructure and materiality, it pulls those conversations to account for the difference in coordination and the effects of coordination, not just simply to say, like, hey, there's a cable or there's a road, and that's an infrastructure of power, but rather it gets used differentially in different contexts and different historical time periods to sort, right, to make accessible or inaccessible, right? So it helps, I think, to pull what would normally be just an attention to, say, like group infrastructure or architecture or materiality into, at least for me, like accounting for the social effects and politics of movement in a way that then I think logistics also connects it to actual histories of logistical systems that people would recognize as such, rather than just saying like calendars or like logistical media. But like, there's a supply chain. It's grounded in the slave trade. Like, we need to account for those things in their relationship to our like media technologies and to the ways that traffic is coordinated now. Like, that's a concrete historical connection. And so that's what like logistics also does, is it pulls us into that world to understand the forms of movement that are going on. And I think that there's a sort of politics to that I feel like that maybe sometimes can be sidestepped in infrastructure, but like maybe with logistics, I hope there would, like, that would allow a more direct connection to those politics. And then I think the third thing is, like, I don't think, whether it's like logistics, yes, points us to sort of optimization and other sorts of techniques of efficiency, but what that does is it ties directly into like histories of capitalism and economic like structures that like I think helps us to understand something like, you know, if you're thinking about like shelving as a logistical technology, it's more than just like a typical like STS, like, look, here's how the shelf is created and this is like what the shelf does. But it carries a set of implications and connections, at least I feel, that would make us think about not just optimization, but the role of optimization in differentiating and capitalizing on the circulation of bodies.
Hi. This might be my own particular question, so forgive me, that feels a little esoteric, but it comes out of the history of capitalism. I studied the history of warehousing. And I'm really interested in these three words and how they connect: optimization, coordination, and metamorphosis. And I labor on metamorphosis because in the context of the political economy of capitalism in the US, metamorphosis legally is the definition of manufacturing, whereas assembly, refining, mixing, all sorts of other manipulating activities are distinct from metamorphosis, from manufacturing. And the definition of metamorphosis is change of form. Okay, so it's an idea about production as opposed to circulation, as opposed to coordination. So this is what I'm wondering: does logistics encompass metamorphosis actually, or I mean, might you think of supply chains, logistical networks as networks of warehouses, of sites of assembly, but not metamorphosis? And what would be at stake in that distinction? And another way of phrasing this is just a question I've had for a while about the difference between thinking about commodity chains, which was a sort of older way of studying sweatshops, say in the 90s, and now logistics. So do you see any anything striking in that context?
Yeah, I could say two things about that. One is I visited like a logistics center in El Segundo last year that was, it's the North America's largest warehouse for golf bags. And so there were more golf bags there than anywhere else in the world, and it was quite surreal. But it was also a factory because it involved, there was some assembly of golf bags that had been coming from elsewhere and needed to have labels stitched on them in a certain way, right? And so it was the space was doubled, and so I think that made the point that it's hard to separate distribution from production or logistics from assembly in the way that you're describing. And so if maybe that is a scene of metamorphosis.
Just legally, no. Actually,
Yeah.
in U.S. law, that's not metamorphosis.
Right, okay, so then what's at stake if we try to claim that it's metamorphosis, I guess is the question. Is that a move that we want to make to shine a light on it in some way? And then the second more conceptual response I have is, this is in a way a response to Shannon, your comment about the aleatory, and it's that I feel like the aleatory is key to logistics and maybe to logistical metamorphosis, because logistics always has to expand to take in the random, right? So the one person who disrupts or does something unexpected, logistics is a system that's got to then account for that, bring it into its systematic knowledge and set up a new procedure for it. So when Henry Box Brown mails himself from slavery in Richmond, Virginia to freedom in Philadelphia in 1849, and then publicizes it, by 1850 we have another Fugitive Slave Act that, and we have slave hunters looking for enslaved people in boxes, right? So it's that random thing that then the system begins to account for. So there's a way in which metamorphosis is like constantly refreshing logistics, I think.
I mean, I just love the problems of made in, right? Like what made in means and what we want it to mean, which is, attached to your question, I think, in some way. And, the idea of stitching the label on, right, is not necessarily the legal, requirement for made in, right? It has to be substantially, produced with materials or, right, the actual, legal wording of what made in means. But it raises this question, why are we always so invested in where something's made, right? Because that's not just, about logistics. Often it's about like cultural values and, political attachments. And so, metamorphosis in that sense speaks to some sort of more fundamental change that we want out of made in, right? And assembly does not. Yeah.
I would say, for me, logistics helps me to think about the kind of moment of activation. So when a space or a site or a thing becomes activated, which is a kind of metamorphosis, and it helps me think through that in a way that other concepts like infrastructure or network don't. Like infrastructure can sometimes be too fixed in place, kind of conceptually. So this moment of activation, it's like, how does something become activated and toward what end? So sometimes it's optimization, but it could be other things, right? And so that's why I think the temporal aspect of logistics is so important. Like it's about movement through space and time. And that's, it's about this kind of coordination of these spatial temporal kinds of logics.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what this means for, American law, but I do know that, within the context of you know, that within the context of, you know, my field, which is, you know, Black studies, within that context, the distinction between production and distribution, or production and transportation, is pretty blurry. If, for instance, and let's say, you know, that the most important and the most fundamental commodity that existed within the slave economy was the slave. The commodity that led to all other commodities. Even if you wanted to be like really a strict kind of Marxian, at least within the context of a certain formulation, maybe early on in Capital, not more fundamental than money, but because the slave was a commodity that was immediately financializable, right? The slave was also a financial instrument. So if you know, and we also know that is a crucial element of what one might call the making of the slave, were these modalities of transportation, whether you're talking about the Middle Passage and the slave ship, or you're talking about the slave coffle within the domestic American slave trade, that these were also places where, whatever you want to call it, subjectivity was being made or unmade, as the case may be. But again, it wasn't just the subjectivity of the enslaved person that was being made within that context either. So it's just, that's why there's a way in which if one argues that modern logistics is, if not grounded, at least significantly altered and shaped by the slave trade. What that also means is that, again, these complicated undoings and deregulations and deformations of logistics are already in place there as well. One of the primary ones being, again, this inability to make a simple distinction, to make these distinctions between production and transportation, between buyer and seller, you know, between commodity and financial instrument. This is this crucible which on the one hand produces these categories and also unmakes these categories at the same time.
I think even those paired terms that Fred just mentioned, buyer and seller, import, export, that's where I think the mediation frame can become really useful, because there are different types of techniques, software, middleware, all types of things that have to do that translation work. And think about manufacturing or transformation as something more theoretical or philosophical than actually chemically or physically transforming the body of an object. It is interesting to think about how if you get on a slave ship, the two ends of the Middle Passage, it's a totally different ontological subject on the two ends of that chain. Even looking at the way the logistical system is mediated by multiple forms of interlocking pieces of enterprise software with middleware that you need to translate in between them, that object is optimized and becomes a totally different thing at each person, and each different person sitting in a different computer station according to the logic of each different piece of software. So it's optimized for that specific software logic, I guess you could say. So it's kind of transformed in that way. So I don't know that it addresses all the parts of your question. Maybe that's another kind of a different way of thinking about what transformation constitutes.
Thanks. So I apologize, I can't get to my question, which would have done that, which is the Margaret Thatcher quote, even if like, there is no such thing as society, has perpetually irked me to the point that it's become an inside joke that whenever my friends and I are sort of annoyed about like the poor social behavior of people in public, we say, you live in a society, you need to like move away from the closing doors of the subway. And this conversation is like having me reflect upon the ways in which subjectivity and logistics isn't just sort of becoming of ontological categories, but the becoming of being situated within social forms, either quite explicitly in the case of exclusion, such as in slavery, or like, you know, the coming into like a system that's supposed to encourage mutual flourishing, like the public library. So I'm curious to what extent you see there is like a bump in the road when you think about logistics from the perspective of like a more literary, subjective formation perspective versus an infrastructural one where the macro lens is sort of off and you're always looking at the movement of people as collectives rather than individuals. And if logistics seems like an interesting way of sort of suturing those together.
Can you say that last part one more time?
Sure. I guess, do you see a distinction between an approach to logistics through the lens of subjectivity and the individual versus one where the emphasis is more on collective behavior, a kind of like STS approach through the building of infrastructures that create social behavior rather than having sort of a priori formed in what is conscious to mind? Does logistics sort of float comfortably between those two poles and allow us to approach the problem differently?
Well, so the other, so part of what we're doing, you know, this stuff we're writing is looking at Kafka and Metamorphosis, but there's a really interesting metamorphosis of the metamorphosis, and it takes the new form of a film called The Watermelon Man, which not probably that many people have seen. It was directed by Melvin Van Peebles and stars this actor named Godfrey Cambridge, who was a kind of important black actor in the early 70s. And he starts off the picture in whiteface, and he's a salesman. He lives with his family, and it's really amazing comic first sort of sequence of the film in which he is, he races the bus every day. He waits till the bus passes his house, and then he runs, he does all these shortcuts and catches the bus, you know, some blocks away, and the bus driver's consciously trying to beat him. It's the traveling salesman's problem in the sense that, but he turns it into a joke and into a kind of contest. And the metamorphosis part comes in where one day he just wakes up and he's black, right? And then increasingly he becomes estranged from his family, just like Greg Samsa does, and eventually he's not killed, he's not thrown out in that way, but just leaves. And at the end of the film, the climax, the ending of the film is this really sort of poignant moment where you just see him leaving his new office and going into a bar in the black community and having a drink where people are dancing. And there's this kind of sense that, well, what he's lost in the form of a sort of normative individuality, he gains by entrance into a certain kind of black social life. Now, if you think about this with regard to the slave trade, this is why this problem of optimization always butts up against the problem of monstrosity, because the fact is that even under the most brutally oppressive conditions, the nature of that logistical supply chain was such that people were thrown together, even in the hold of the ship, even in the slave coffin, right? That these still constituted social spaces. And insofar as they constituted social spaces, they constituted opportunities to disrupt, right, the normative construction of subjectivity, which was on the one hand monstrously imposed upon, or these normative processes of individuation which are monstrously and brutally imposed upon the enslaved, precisely at the level at which they could never actually achieve, right, a normative individuation. But in the refusal of normative individuation that was at the same time imposed upon them, they were also crucially important to the development of, or the constitution of normative individuation for the class of people who are associated with ownership. So that seems to me to be a place where sociality does militate against, you know, these sometimes brutal processes of optimization, like y'all were talking about before. And the other part of it is that, you know, another example of it might be you know, the life of, you know, the hobos, the kings of the road, that kind of sociality. Woody Guthrie talks about it in Bound for Glory in the opening chapter, where the people who are, you know, sleeping and moving and transporting themselves on the boxcars were sort of, they laid on each other as if they were one another's pillows, right? That kind of social hapticality is another way to move against the grain of the structures of, you know, imposed efficiency that sometimes we talk about under the rubric of logistics.
I could add to that a little bit, maybe, to just say that I think the opposite of that and the danger of the way that logistics can kind of relentlessly kind of expand to take up and forestall resistances to it, so like forestall that kind of sociality, is when it commodifies the ethical imperative to occupy an approved place as the consumer in the supply. So this begins in the 18th century when in Britain the anti-slavery movement is about not having sugar in your tea because it was harvested through enslaved labor, right? And so, and now in our own ethical moment of like being a good consumer, right, is about making sure that our the supply chain of the products we're consuming, you know, isn't like ethically violating workers, right? And so that itself becomes commodified in a way that I think lends itself to individual optimization. How can I be like the most ethical person as a consumer, right? But that's different from the sociality that you were just describing of enslaved people in the hold of a slave ship or hobos on trains. So I think that's the place to me where like collectivity really, yeah, I mean, it can get, I don't know, it's tough. Like I feel like it's got such a strong commodifying, individualizing drive, but then on the other hand, it is also a place where individuals can, I guess, get together and like kind of make demands as consumers for improvements in supply chains. So I don't know, it's the yin and the yang, perhaps.
Last question, I think.
Thank you so much, everyone. I had two short questions. One, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the sort of, we were speaking at the beginning about logistical imaginaries, sort of Alice and these kinds of things. I wondered if you could talk more about the logistical unconscious. It seems to me that so many logistical systems, as systems, say a sewer system is one of the important logistical thing for social life in the present. That don't normally get spoken about in these kinds of situations because there seems to be a sort of rush to Amazon or something like that. Or even in the sort of Amazon example, the unconscious of that system, like the workers are actually picking off books from shelves, which of course Amazon likes to raise in the kind of fantasy of autonomous drones delivering everything. But we kind of know in that imaginary itself so much is erased. Or in the case of slavery, the kind of histories of these systems get in some ways shut out of what we conceptualize when we talk about logistics. The second point, and you can see this is related to one, I wonder if in always relating everything to capitalism, we do ourselves a bit of a disservice of not being able to conceive of other possibilities. And I'm really struck in this case, the traveling salesman problem, the modern solution to it, famously is given by Coleridge, right, who is a Stalinist planner in late 1920s Soviet Union, kind of optimizing plywood production, which then went to a Nobel Prize later on, and his mathematical equations are now embedded in Google's page rank system. So I wonder if actually thinking of non-price-based semiotic systems for distribution of stuff, which is the classical problem of a centrally planned economy, gives us a way to think of these questions that doesn't always presuppose a certain form of capitalism, or maybe in a different idiom, allows us to think of the metamorphosis on a kind of historical track of how certain problems taken up by different social systems or from different perspectives, and then have kind of unintended consequences in their time.
I can just give one example, because I did a project last year about the future of mapping. And this was drawing on the traveling salesman problem, but not applying it to a capitalist kind of case study. It was using kind of World Health Organizations, trying to use artificial intelligence to look at all the different climatic, geographic, social factors that might exist in a certain part of the global south, for instance, where there might be an explosion of a particular type of disease. So you have to think about how particular climatic conditions might create kind of heat sinks in certain areas, and how river flows might change the spread of different types of, so you kind of have to think like a climate, think like a mosquito, think like all of these things, put them all into kind of a machine, and essentially pump out a map that will then use the traveling salesman problem to determine how to deploy your staff to distribute mosquito nets and vaccines and other sorts of things. So you're still drawing on that traveling salesman, which might be a capitalistically framed problem, but you're applying it to a non-kind of commercial type of application. And that logic draws on kind of other species ways of migration through space, and other kind of environmental forms, ways of, I don't know what I call it a logic, but different kind of environmental forms of movement, I guess you could say. So that might be one example of a way to think about beyond kind of a price-based mode of movement.
I was going to say to the first question about the kind of unconscious or the hidden or the kind of unseen, what is attractive to me about logistics as a concept is exactly that it kind of takes us into those realms and allows us to see them as active, like to see the movement within those spaces. So it's not just about the abstract notion of an Amazon distribution center where we know something is happening, but it's about actually going in there and seeing like precisely how that movement is coordinated and choreographed in a certain kind of way. And it allows us, so thinking about the logistical media of those processes, scanners, barcodes, time to completion schedules, like all of these forms that structure the bodies and choreograph their movements, through space and time, like down to the most granular kind of level. And some of the most, exciting work and interesting work that's been coming up under this rubric of logistics is, to me, that kind of work that's going in and actually doing field work. Like Mac McClellan wrote a piece 6 or 7 years ago now for Mother Jones that was like, she like got a job in an Amazon-like distribution center, and wrote, gave these dispatches of like how these logistical media actually were affecting her body, and the kind of burden that they imposed. So that's, I think, one of the things that's attractive to me in a way that some of the other concepts or words that we've used historically to describe these things like network, infrastructure, logistics gives us maybe more precision or something like that. So.
I think it's just to riff off that for a second. I think that one of the things that I don't believe that obviously there are modes of logistics and logistical systems that are not capitalist, right? But I think that one of the things that when thinking about trying to analyze logistics or going to supply chains or distribution centers, to talk about distribution or to talk about infrastructure often doesn't carry with it the unnecessary question of is it capitalist, or to what ends are optimization, toward what ends are we optimizing? And I think that that's one of the things that, at least when reading people's work in logistics, or the people here, right, that the question of sort of the either ethical or political states of the project of optimization and efficiency or coordination must be included in that question, and that they're not naturally capitalist, but capitalism is really great at deploying such techniques. And it's that kind of conversation that I feel is exciting. And that, again, this is not how all people have studied logistical media, but it is a thread that, like, I feel like at least goes through the panelists here that, you know, we had hoped to foreground or draw out in assembling this group.
Yeah, I would just add, I think because Nigel Thrift identifies logistics as the unconscious of capital, it's very hard to get away from that formation. But it makes you want to ask what the unconscious of logistics is. And I want that to be something like, you know, aesthetic pleasure, or, you know, some kind of like physical pleasure that is unenlistable back into, you know, capitalist circuitry, which is, you know, hard because that's what it's designed to supply. So, but I think hapticality, you know, phenomenological kinds of observations. Liam just mentioned choreography. I think there's a certain pleasure in, you know, when there's the pleasure of when things come together in a satisfying way, right? And that's kind of the logistical fantasy, is that it all flows and comes together and it moves from point A to B, and right? So the capital version of that is to do it efficiently and make money. But maybe there's some other pleasure that can be had in some sort of arrangement like that that we have to look really hard to find.
I believe we are already out of time. So we're out of time, but don't leave the room. We have another exciting panel up next. But in the meantime, let's thank our panelists.